Yu-Gi-Oh! Is dying is a claim almost as old as the game itself, a claim that nearly goes hand in hand with the existence of the card game. Over the years, multiple videos have been made about this topic, some of them outright arguing that the game is dead for X, Y, or Z reason, and others giving a more nuanced look at problems with the game, dips in sales, problems retaining players, and what could be done to fix it. Although I don't think the claim was as prominent in the early days, I started noticing criticism about the state of Yu-Gi-Oh! Starting in the Teledad era of the game. People said synchros are broken, they're ruining the game, Dark Arm Dragon is too overpowered, it needs to be banned. This was the common consensus of anyone who wasn't enjoying steamrolling their opponents with this massively OP deck. The game had changed a bit at that point in its lifespan, and it has absolutely changed a lot since its inception. I would also say that we're at a current point where it seems like every few months to a year we basically get a new Teledad deck that people say is going to make them quit the game. So are these complaints valid? Is there something wrong with this game? If you've seen any of my other videos, you know the answer I'm going to give is yes. Rather than give you an entire history of the game of Yu-Gi-Oh!, I'm going to break down the issues with the game into a few parts. Those parts being, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is too fast, the Yugi Boomer concerned that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is too broken, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is too complicated. There's a fundamental point that I think these issues boil down to, how hand traps and wombo combos have affected the game, and then finally, what the solution is. For anyone who's familiar with Yu-Gi-Oh!'s history, I think this issue goes without saying. The speed of the game has progressed to a point where what used to be several turns of gameplay has now been condensed into 1 to 4 turns. Decks that are specifically designed as having the intent to OTK your opponent are now commonplace rather than a potential possibility based on your opening hand. Now, fast gameplay isn't always necessarily a bad thing. Slow resource slogfests aren't exactly the most exciting gameplay. We don't need to go back to the days of, I set a monster in a face down and pass, and I set a monster in 2 face downs and pass. I normal summon a monster, attack, and pass. In my opinion, there's definitely a healthy middle ground between the modern day and the game of the past. It's fine for games to have a little more hustle, whether that means summoning a medium to big monster on your first turn, or setting up the main pieces to your combo or engine to get things rolling. You know, these aren't necessarily bad things. The problems arise when you're able to summon out all of your bosses, get several negates and disruption onto the field, and end the turn with a hand trap or 2 to spare on your first turn. Usually what happens is a player will go through a series of extenders until they've amassed as much negation as possible. A player can play through nearly half their deck on their first turn, and a third or more of their extra deck as long as the opponent doesn't have hand traps. If it's your opponent's first turn, having hand traps to stop them is essentially the only way to shut this solitaire style of game down, as you haven't yet had time to play anything. And we'll get into more on that later. This level of speed is definitely problematic. For a new player, or someone who even just doesn't really know the effects of all the cards your opponent is playing offhand, you're putting them in a position where they might need to keep track of 3, 5, or 7 different floating effects that trigger in the graveyard, in the banish zone, when summoned, when used as a summoning material, or at the end of the turn. It's a lot for a player to keep up with, especially if you're playing in real life. Even in Master Duel, you might see 15 cards fly across the screen in a single turn and not have time to read any of them to understand what's going on. It's one thing to slowly hit someone with 3 to 4 cards every turn. I think it's fair to say that even as many as 7 cards a turn would still be manageable to keep up with depending on how many effects they have. But you're not going to attract newbies or casuals with turns that involve playing 15 to 25 cards. Card effects have become more complex as well, and even I find myself overwhelmed at times over the sheer number and the pace of cards being played in a single turn. The necessity behind this level of speed and condensed gameplay comes purely from power creep. Every year, Konami needs to release a new strongest archetype to continue encouraging players to buy new products. It's left us with a game that would usually go for about 10 turns to a game that now lasts at most 3. And because the game moves at this pace, there are just so many cards that have been outpaced and are flat out not good anymore. Flip effects, too slow. Trap cards, which make up 1/3 of the overarching card types in the game. Too slow if you can't play it from your hand. This issue has also led to a lot of trap cards getting absolutely busted effects in an attempt to keep them relevant and they still don't see play. Why would they? They're useless if you aren't going first, because your opponent has had a full turn to set up before you can even set them to the field, and they could quite possibly even get blown up before your turn is over, leaving you with no chance to even activate them. What good does that do when you could have played another extender instead, or another hand trap? There are other cards too that have basically always been bad, but now are essentially unplayable. Geminis were never good except outside maybe Illblood and Gigaplant, but there's basically no point in Konami printing any Gemini cards ever again at this point. There are other cards too that have basically always been bad, but now are essentially unplayable. Geminis were never good except maybe Illblood and Gigaplant, but there's basically no point in Konami printing any Gemini cards ever again. Unions are a bit better off with some of the support they've gotten over the years, but they still don't fare that much better. You don't have time to normal summon a monster twice for Geminis. You need to be able to special summon that Union monster to the field if you want to use it to equip to a monster, and even if you get it equipped, its effect probably isn't good enough to make a difference. You have 1, possibly 2 turns to get the job done of winning the game, and the slower your cards are, the less likely you are to win. You have to match the speed of these new, better cards to stand a chance. This brings us to the next point, something that Yu-Gi-Oh players have been complaining about since the Teledad days. Yu-Gi-Oh is too broken. I think in the past these concerns may have been over-exaggerated. Yes, there has always been a best deck for basically every format, but I think even back in the earlier days of the game, the margin separating the best deck from the pet decks and the fun decks was not nearly as wide as it is now. Because the game was played much slower, with the right additions and the right deck building, you could potentially, although unlikely, overcome higher tier decks. Does that mean that decks like the Chess Archfiends or Flemvel were ever going to be top tier or playable? No, definitely not. But maybe you could play like a pure Ice Barrier deck or Gravekeepers and still win a game off of your opponent depending on the build of the deck and the support cards you added in. I would argue that even if you weren't winning, you still had the ability to play more of the game and see more back and forth. At the very least, you're probably activating and resolving more of your cards than you would in a game today. The distance between decks nowadays is so great that even decks from 2 years ago probably won't stand a chance against the modern meta of today. Maybe at best those decks would be in the pet deck range that we were talking about earlier, but if they are just barely within that range. And that's just 2 years ago. You go 4, 5 years back, and those cards are completely out of contention. This definitely ties in with the speed issue of the game. Cards designed a decade ago were not designed with where Yu-Gi-Oh is at today in mind. They have more restrictions, less consistency in searching and recycling resources, and generally just don't provide as much card advantage as cards designed today, hence why they've been weeded out from modern meta gameplay. By contrast, the cards released today absolutely seem broken by comparison. This isn't to say that Yu-Gi-Oh hasn't always had broken cards. Like I said earlier, there's always usually been 2 to 3 best decks in each format. And even upon release, Yu-Gi-Oh had cards like Delinquent Duo, Pot of Greed, Ultimate Offering, The Forceful Sentry, Different Dimension Return, all cards that are definitely broken. So why weren't people crying out about how unfair Yu-Gi-Oh was back then? To be honest, I think it's because of the speed and balance of cards around those cards. For this point, I'm going to refer to the anime. Obviously these duels are scripted, but I think the Yu-Gi-Oh anime showcases the game at its best. It shows how exciting the game can be when played a certain way. The decks the characters use might have stuff like Cards of Sanctity, Sixth Sense, Magic Virus Cannon, Crush Card Virus, all insanely broken cards. But they're playing these cards alongside Gaia the Fierce Knight and Sagi the Dark Clown and Salamandra. And it was the same for older decks. Okay, you've got Pot of Greed, which is always going to be a good card, but what is it going to draw you into? Bakochi the Locomotive and Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer? Good cards for their era, but neither of them are going to turn into 12 other cards that ends you on 2 negates. Nowadays, everything has to be optimized. You aren't going to get slower cards off your searches and your draws. You're going to get fast cards that turn into another card, that special summons back a monster, that lets you search for another card, that lets you summon a monster from your extra deck, that lets you activate a card from your deck that you can play that turn to search a spell and trap, that lets you search a monster, that can special summon itself to summon another from the graveyard, and then summon another monster from your extra deck. Given this state of gameplay, I don't think the Yugi boomers are necessarily wrong when they complain that the game is broken. I'm not saying we need to go back to the days of set 1 and pass, but certainly there has to be a healthy middle ground somewhere. A place where you can have games that take 5 to 15 turns take 1 to 3 minute tops, and where players aren't playing through half of their deck on their first turn. Yu-Gi-Oh! Has definitely gotten more complicated over the years. I would argue that this again isn't necessarily a bad thing in some cases. As with all my criticisms in this video, the real issue comes down to balance. Obviously there are going to be cards and decks that perform long combos. I don't think that's a bad thing for the game. A lot of archetypes have effects that are what we would call similar but different too, which can make these long combos easier to understand. For example, Fur Hire seems really complicated with all the text they have until you realize, oh, the little guys all special summon a Fur Hire from the hand, and then they do something when a Fur Hire is special summoned. The big guys all do something when special summoned, and then have a second effect they can do. Even on a slightly deeper level, Dinah and Sajida offer protection, Wiz and Rafale negate. It's still not terribly complicated. There are trends you can recognize. The Millennium archetype, as much as I hate it for its boring gameplay and OTK focus, is also kind of the same vein. The monsters go in the spell and trap zone and summon themselves for free if you have Millennium Ankh in your hand, or at a cost of 2,000 life points if you don't. And then they do something when they're special summoned. With this design, you can skip over a lot of card text and just go straight to the what does it do after it does the thing that everyone in this archetype does part of the effect. Now, what do you do when your opponent is playing Rika, Aroma, Sun Avalon, or Rescue Snake Eyes, or White Forest, Diabellstar, Witchcrafter? This is when you get games that are moving at a speed that are really hard to comprehend. And if you were to show them to a new player, you would probably scare that new player away. Even as someone who's played the game for decades at this point, I have a hard time keeping up sometimes. And that's even watching on Master Duel where the effects are highlighted. Forget playing on paper, this is not a good state to be in, and it's not something that's going to bring in new players or encourage casuals to keep up with the game. To me, the fun of Yu-Gi-Oh! Has always revolved around interesting interactions between players chaining effects, beating interesting game states set up by the opponent, making comebacks by luring your opponent into a trap, or a comeback started by a top deck, or a plan set in motion several turns prior. This strategy and intelligent planning of how to use your cards and when is what gives life to the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! In order for most of those things to happen, you need to actually understand what's going on. When you do, you can have a lot of fun, and sometimes more complicated game states can lead to more interesting duels and more fun puzzles to solve. Again, as long as it's not going too far overboard. And even still within these complexities in the current game, I would argue that there are only a few select priorities. You could say that these priorities have always existed in the game, but it's very clear when comparing cards from today to cards of the past that these priorities have been streamlined and optimized to the extreme. The current priorities when playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Are to have negates in the form of hand traps, set up negates that will go off on your opponent's turn to cancel out their cards, special summon monsters, and to play cards that will either extend your play or recycle your resources. This has created, in my opinion, a very linear style of gameplay. Decks may have some focus or specific strategy to them that sets them apart from other decks, but these 4 keys are always going to be the ultimate focus, just done in slightly different ways, and with a boatload of cards you have to keep up with as you're trying to get through these priorities. Basically, all archetypes nowadays have multiple cards in them that will search for another card when played, special summon another monster, or get you back a card from the graveyard. These are the extenders that optimize play. And that is the singular issue that all of these issues boil down to. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is way too optimized. Earlier in the game's lifespan, and I would say for most of the game's existence, card design didn't function in this way. archetypes weren't required to have designated extenders and searchers. As an example, look at the new Ancient Fairy Dragon cards. Now, I'm not in any way saying that these cards are broken or that they're going to be meta relevant, but I think they just serve a good example of how current card design is being handled. The Ancient Fairy Dragon Synchro draws and searches, Karibon special summons, Regulus special summons, searches, and draws, Spore special summons, the field spell searches, and then Eternal Sunshine negates effects. Some of these cards do have other effects than the ones listed, but the point is obvious. The other effects they have aren't good enough. They'll never be good enough. They will never compare to these core best effects in Yu-Gi-Oh! To draw and recover resources, to special summon monsters, to search out more cards, and to negate your opponent's cards. It used to be that cards in these categories would have some kind of cost or more difficult activation requirement associated with them. But nowadays, you can't afford to discard a card or tribute a monster to do an effect. And now we're even seeing decks that will return cards given up at a cost back to you to negate the price you paid. Now, as a basic requirement, these 4 effects are essentially given to cards at no cost so that combos can be bigger and longer. And that's all this game is boiling down to now. Some of this stuff is fine, sure, because it's in smaller doses or it has a bit more balancing to it. You know, a little bit of searching makes the game play more smoothly, absolutely. Yeah, you might need to negate your opponent at some point in order to prevent them from running off with things. Maybe you don't always need to pay a cost for an effect because you need to get some kind of momentum back when the chips are low and you're basically out of cards. But every deck is now focused on optimizing the fastest or safest route to do these 4 effects, and then to end on a board that can negate most of your opponent's cards, or just create a board that they simply can't out with their cards. It's about playing a card that gets another card, that gets another card, that gets another card, and another card until you've played half your deck on turn 1 and ended on a board that stops your opponent from playing the game. It's this weird and, in my opinion, unfun combination of overly complicated but also incredibly similar and mundane. And this segues into the next point, because I know what some of you are thinking. But if you just hand trap at the choke point, they can't do all that. Yes, I am 100% aware of this fact. I play Master Duel. I have seen the Instagram posts all the time of the guide to beating the new Blue Eyes support. Where to hand trap Ryzeal, and it shows which hand traps you're supposed to use against which monsters or spells, which board breakers work against which decks, etc., etc. But to be completely blunt and honest, I think this kind of gameplay is just boring and pathetic. There's no planning, there's no setup, there's no combos, no thought, just, okay, we've reached the step in the combo where I discard my Ash Blossom now. Staples have always been a part of decks, but staples nowadays are mostly just hand traps. And hand traps aren't really complicated. You don't really need to set up combos for them. You either trigger them at the right time and shut down everything your opponent is doing, or you didn't draw enough and they're going to keep going and you're going to get steamrolled.
One of these days we're going to get to play this fucking deck. We haven't gotten to yet. Like, it feels like regardless of what deck we're playing, regardless of how well we're playing it, something like 60% of our games are going to be determined by this little hand trap minigame at the very beginning.
And because of the latter point, a lot of decks nowadays too function as one-card combos. That way, if you get 5 out of 6 of your going second hand negated on turn 1, you still have 1 card left that you can play that can combo you into a board that can beat your opponent. And this type of gameplay is also a huge problem. It makes it so that lower tier decks will almost never be able to stand up to this kind of play, for starters. You know, I mean, God forbid you have 2 negates and 1 disruption card against someone who now not only has that one card combo that can create a game-ending board, like Tenpai Dragon, but they also have 2 other cards in their hand to really hammer home that message. The only way to balance the one card combo is by creating more restrictive and oppressive hand traps. And eventually, the only way to beat those restrictive and oppressive hand traps will be to create more resilient one card combos. It creates a state of gameplay where eventually you and your opponent can just compare opening hands and see if they have enough negates to stop your wombo, or if they fall short and you can play through half your deck and set something up that they can't break. Forget bluffing, forget luring your opponent into a trap, forget setting up a game state over a few turns. Optimized Yu-Gi-Oh! Means that everything is the same. Everyone is searching, everyone is special summoning, every card draws something, every card negates something. Only one card combos are worth playing. Anything that can't create something on its own as a one card will take up too many resources. Anything with a cost is unplayable. Any effect besides these 4 is just an add-on. But to be worth playing, the card must do one of these 4 things as well. People have offered a lot of solutions to this issue. Time period formats is one of them. Although, as someone who has never really enjoyed the meta, I don't know how much this will do for casual players. It may bring back some older players, but one thing I also find frustrating about this idea is the inability to play new support that's been released for older decks. So if you're playing Six Samurai, let's say you're a big Six Samurai fan, and you're playing in like the 2011 era when they got the new Six Samurai monsters and the Synchro monster, all of the new support that was just released for them is now off limits. And if you do want to play something more casual, you're probably not going to be able to keep up with the meta of the time anyway. So again, I can see how it could bring back some older players who enjoyed playing the game in that time period, but I don't know how much it'll do for new players or casuals. I've also seen the suggestion of deck tiers, where decks are placed into tiers of play, and then only S tier decks can play against each other, only A tier decks can play against each other. Maybe you can do crossover between A and B tier decks or C and D tier decks, etc., etc. And this, I think, is a bit better of a solution, but you may run into issues with being stuck playing the same decks because they're the only decks in your bracket, or even certain decks rising to the top of their tier, which is going to, in some ways, create a lot of the same problems of current Yu-Gi-Oh!, which is that being people just choosing the decks that are the most optimized instead of choosing decks that are the most fun. A final solution that I've rarely seen talked about, most likely because it would be the most difficult to implement, is implementing a point per card system. With this, every card would be worth a certain number of points. You would have a point cap on your deck, and once you hit that cap, you would no longer be able to add cards to your deck. This way, you could assign higher points to higher tier cards and make it difficult to play multiple copies of those higher tier cards, or make players choose which higher tier cards they're going to add so that they don't go over the cap. It would also benefit lower tier decks because due to the lower power level and therefore lower points assigned to those cards, they would have more room to add commonly used stapled cards to balance the playing field. The main issue with staples is not that they exist, it's that you can be playing a deck like Fiendsmith Ryziel and also be playing Fuelos, Imperm, Ash Blossom. Honestly, I don't think these cards would be too much of a problem if you added them to a deck like Watts or Mecha Phantom Beast. Really, I think there just needs to be a way to limit optimized play. It's fine to have the game as it currently exists in the format that it exists in for players who enjoy that. I don't know what the endpoint of the current state of Yu-Gi-Oh! Will be, because there's absolutely going to be a point where you can't power creep anymore. But there are people who enjoy it, and I'm fine with letting them ride that train until it hits the last stop. But for the longevity of the game, and for the sake of attracting more players as a whole, there should be a place that you can go to and play with official rules that don't require you to know when to drop Ash Blossom on the Ryziel combo. A place that you don't have to read and understand the effects of 15 different cards in a single turn. There are somewhere around 14,000 cards in the game right now, and I would argue that by a generous estimate, 13,000 of them are completely useless to play at your locals or any official tournament. Why not create a different format and give these cards a place to go? I know this topic has been discussed to death, but with the current Duelist Cup going on, I am feeling it more than ever. You can see a lot of replays from my L's in this video, and I know I probably shouldn't complain or expect much considering what I'm playing versus what I'm playing against, but it does bum me out that there's nowhere I can go to compete at a level that is equal to the level of the decks that I'm playing at. I really do wish that there was somewhere to go where you could play against people who are less concerned about optimization and more concerned about building interesting decks with cool themes or unique combos and, quite frankly, just having fun. But anyways, I appreciate you guys for listening. If you made it this far in the video, please feel free to like and subscribe. It really helps out with boosting the channel and boosting the content. If you guys have thoughts on this issue, please feel free to let me know in the comment section down below, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.